Hey YouTube, welcome to Rampage Reviews. I'm Rampage. We're on the 5th book of the High Republic era. Let's dive in! So like I said, we're on the 5th book. This is called The Rising Storm, and it takes place just a year after the Light of the Jedi events. It is 231 years BBY, and the story starts off a little bit like this. Elzar Mann is a Jedi from the Light of the Jedi. I believe he had kind of a lesser role in the book, but he has a much bigger role in this book. They got the hero of Hetzel, Avar Kriss, comes back in The Rising Storm. You've got Stellan Gios, who, again, he played a fairly large role in the last book. To be honest with you, the books are kind of meshing together, so it's hard for me to really, point out the bigger players in each book, especially because in the last book, there were so many people that were introduced. There's a lot of Jedi that were introduced in the Light of the Jedi, and I believe that's just the nature of the High Republic, especially in this part of the era, the 231 BBY era. So far, this is kind of like peak High Republic material. I've enjoyed it a lot so far. I can't wait to see what else comes with it. There's going to be some other books that take place a year after these events, and like 230 BBY and stuff like that. Very excited to see that stuff. So the book starts out with Elzar Mann, and he's having these visions, and he's having visions about death, people screaming, fights breaking out, war, overall misery altogether. This is kind of the prologue to the story. So once they venture from him, then we start to get introduced to some different people that are going to be having some bigger parts in the story. So if we could skip through about the first 5 or 6 chapters or so, the first person you start with, his name is Udi Dis. He is a member of the Nihil. He's a Force-sensitive person. He just happens to be kind of Marchian's new sidekick, apprentice, whatever. At least that's what you kind of feel him out to be when you first start reading the book. So he's going with Marchian on this mission. Remember, Marchian Ro is the Eye of the Nihil from the last book. So he's the leader of the Nihil. If we could go through Udi's story really quick, just so I can get to the other people. He starts off with Marchian on this mission. Ultimately, what Marchian wants to do is he wants to locate the Leveler, which was the massive beast from stories that took place in 382 BBY when there was the battle on Darna at the planet. I think it was Dalna, with the Path of the Open Hand. They were the ones that owned the beast and that took out Jedi. They basically consumed them, consumed their life force, turned them into these dusty husks on the ground. You turn into ash as soon as you touch him. So he's searching for this beast, and you start to realize that he has connections to the Path of the Open Hand. He has a person or a contact that was a member of the Path of the Open Hand, really greets him warmly when he goes to see this contact. He's with Udi at the moment. Her name is Kufa, and she wants to lead them through this planet that they land on to find the Leveler, who happens to be buried in ice at the moment. And what they want to do is they want to make sure, number one, that the Leveler is still alive, and number two, that the Leveler is still capable of the things that he was legendarily known for in the 382 BBY era. Obviously, like I said in previous videos, this is a very interesting beast, very interesting animal that obviously interacts with the Force in some way, and I really can't wait to see kind of its origins, like where these beasts come from, what the purposes of them were, in their natural habitat. What do they actually do besides being trained or housed by these people to attack Jedi? Obviously they had some other purpose, so I would love to know that going forward. Marchian takes Udi with them, with Kufa, to find the Leveler. They fight some Drengir on the way there, which are these beast-like vines that... Was it Drengir? Actually, I take it back. It wasn't Drengir. It was like a large beast that exists in the planet that they were on, which the planet that they were on was called Ryston. So they're traveling through these caves. They fight this beast. They almost die fighting the beast, but they get through and they find the Leveler. At least they don't necessarily see him or uncover him in any way, but what happens is Udi Dis starts to exhibit some of the symptoms that the Jedi from the old books had when they would come into contact with the Leveler. He would become disoriented, he seemed nauseous, he would lose his connection to the Force, he couldn't see things coming behind him, in front of him, he was just having trouble acting altogether. He couldn't function around this beast. As soon as Marchian sees this, he's seen all he needs to see, and he basically tells Udi, okay, you've done your task, I'm done with you. And then he basically smashes his face in with his boot. So that is the end of Udi as we see it there. Now, that story kind of skips around a few chapters. You kind of see some stuff in between it. And I think that ends in chapter 10 or 11, something like that. Another character, a big character that we see in the book, their name is Tai. I forget the last name. They mostly just refer to her as Tai. But another Force sensitive that is a mercenary, she is asked to accompany another person. Can't remember the person's name. I tried to look it up. It's going to take me too long to do it. Tai travels with this person to basically try to sell this device that she has created, or at least that she owns. And this device is capable of disabling almost all electronic devices surrounding it. It's kind of like an EMP, except you don't really have to just activate it and then it knocks them out. Once it's on, it disables all of the electronic devices surrounding it as long as it's on. It's obviously a very destructive device, and I believe, from what I understand, that this person was just trying to get a buck off of it, trying to sell it to somebody to make a quick buck. I say that because later in the book, it gets into the wrong hands, and this person feels so compelled to tell the Republic that, hey, this is a very dangerous machine. We need to try to get it back. Obviously, they weren't meaning largely malicious act to happen with this machine. That's what it felt like to me. That's what I understood. Tai goes with this person, and they go to this planet called Valo. And Valo is going to be the home or the location of an event called the Republic Fair. And the Chancellor, Lina Soh, still the Chancellor at the time, she organized this fair to allow all of the Republic members, all the Republic planets, especially some of the newcomers into the Republic, to gather and connect and try to show their unity and just raise morale for the people that are involved in the Republic, whether it be government, residents, everyday citizens, military, whatever. They're trying to bring everybody together just to show that we are the Republic. They want to show a strong unity in the Republic. There's one person, though, that is kind of outspoken against this fair happening. It's a senator named Tia Toon, and he is constantly trying to remind Lina Soh, like, we don't need to spend money on this. What we need to do is we need to bolster a defense for the Republic because these Nihil attacks are happening everywhere. And the Drengir, which are these, I didn't define them before, but they're these plants that are massive, that grow at exponential rates, and they're covered in thorns, and they basically are a giant nuisance to people and can, I believe, take out lots of people and kill them. So he is suggesting that there needs to be a defense force created to combat the Nihil and to combat the Drengir problem. He comes off so combative during these meetings that it almost feels like he's trying to be contrarian, I suppose, or he's trying to battle against the Republic leaders, like just to be an opposition force to them. So because of this, when Tai is with her partner to sell this device, they meet with Tia Toon thinking that the senator would want to use this device to her benefit to cause some kind of destruction. They're trying to just offload this to someone who they think might need it. Tia Toon realizes they used an illegal substance or an illegal metal to create this device and is immediately turned off by it and does not want anything to do with it. Now, while the senator and this person are meeting to talk about the device, Elzar Mann and Stellan Gios are hiding on top of a roof listening to the conversation. Once they realize that there's something amiss going on, then they realize, and like I said before, Tai is a Force sensitive and she also owns a lightsaber. That kind of leads Elzar Mann and Stellan Gios to think, oh, maybe she's former Jedi. So once they hear there's a lightsaber in there, because Tia Toon was like, is that a lightsaber? Then they jump into action, basically tell them, hey, you need to cease what you're doing. You're under arrest. You're going to come with us. So then they put up a fight. Tai loses. Spoiler alert. Then they kind of start to interrogate Tia Toon a little bit, like, what's going on? Why are you meeting with these people? Tia Toon wholeheartedly dismisses the idea that he would be involved in trying to purchase a device to do harm to anybody. He heard that there was a device that he could use for his defense force. He didn't know what the device did. He knew very little about the meeting before it happened. Kind of weird for a senator to do that, like just have this meeting about a random device that they know nothing about. I don't know. That was kind of irresponsible, wasn't it? Yeah, probably. They take those two people away. Tia Toon, Stellan Gios, Elzar Mann. I think Indira Stokes is there too. I know they're Jedi from the previous book. They all go and start to ramp up the Republic Fair that's going to happen. Now, before I get too far into what happens after the Republic Fair, I want to highlight some of the events that happened before that. The Nihil are traveling, and they, according to the last book, they are interested in not just sticking to the Outer Rim, but they want to invade the Mid Rim and the Core Worlds to try to expand their presence and possibly do more damage to take more control over Republic space. So they actually decided to attack Cyclor, and more specifically shipyards on the planet Cyclor. They believed that it was a planet that was vulnerable at the time, that they wanted to strike fast, try to cause a lot of damage. I believe Avar Kriss was there at the moment, and they're Buryaga was the Wookiee Jedi that was there, as well as his master. Nib Kasich, I think was her name, or Nib Asik. Names are hard. They have to put up a defense against the Nihil. It's a pretty hard-fought battle, but eventually the Republic is able to win out and chase the Nihil away. The Nihil do a lot of damage, and they kind of consider it a victory in the moment. After that, the Nihil start to party. They're like, hey, we went and did a lot of damage. We're taking what we want. We're looting and living free, living the way that we want. What are we going to do now? One of the Tempests decides that they need to strike fast. They need to go and try to hit them where it hurts in another vulnerable place. And what they realize is that the Republic Fair is going on Valo, and they think that they should strike Valo really quickly. I think it was Pan Ada that decided this. When he decided it, Marchion was against it because he thought we need to think bigger than this and we need to be better planners and try to be more organized. And Pan is saying, no, we need to just go and like strike fast because they're not going to know what hit them. We need to do it now. And that way we can take control and keep them on their heels. He's saying this in front of an entire audience of members of the Nihil, or at least followers of the Nihil. Marchion notices this. He quickly tries to take control of the speech that's going on, starts to take the attention away just from striking fast, but from that to hate against the leaders at large, Lina Soh and Republic leaders at large. He directs people in that attention to say, we need to have death to the Republic, death to Lina Soh, let's go take them out. Pan is a little pissed that Marchion kind of took control of that spotlight right there. But in any case, Pan kind of got what he wanted. And now they're going to go try to attack the Republic on Valo. Before this happens, Elzar Mann starts to have this affair with one of the people on the planet, which he totally regrets after because obviously Jedi aren't supposed to have attachments. They're definitely not supposed to engage in those sort of acts when their awareness needs to be at their best. The Nihil attack, they attack fast, and what they started to do now is they started to release this gas, and they did this on Cyclor too. They release a gas that kind of surrounds space where everybody is. It's supposed to seep into everybody's ship. They call it their war fog, I believe. It's poisonous, so if it seeps into people's ships, it poisons them. It makes it hard to fight. They put up a very large fight. Stellan Gios is left like beaten and battered. He is on his last leg after this. Everybody's basically a little beaten and battered at this point. The Nihil are able to take off and they escape. I'm kind of glossing over this. The battle takes a large part of the book. I believe it's probably like 100 pages. So if I skip over some important parts, it's just because I want to kind of feed you the hot points, the details of kind of what moves the story along. So the Nihil are able to escape. They did a ton of damage. They bombed a lot of the planet. They had basically like carpet bombings over the planet, which took out a lot of stuff. The Chancellor almost died, but she was able to survive. Like I said, Stellan Gios is beaten and battered. A lot of people are beaten and battered at this point. But they were able to take prisoner of one of the Nihil members. And after they take prisoner of this person, they realize that the Nihil have actually been listening into the Republic's comms for a long time, and that's how they're able to strike on vulnerable planets. And then they also learn of their ability to travel uncharted paths without going through regular Republic hyperlanes. Elzar is feeling regretful for his actions before, and he actually feels like that his behavior is starting to slip into degenerate behavior that might lead him to the dark side. And he actually comes out and tells Stellan, like, I need help. Can you help me kind of figure out my place and like how I can overcome these feelings that I have? And Stellan's like, yeah, we're all here to help each other. Like, if you need help, you come to me for sure. Another thing that points to that is during the battle, Elzar actually uses the Force to clear out this ship, I believe. He uses a pretty strong use of the Force. He actually taps into the dark side when he does it. There are Nihil who witnessed this, and I believe one of the people who witnessed it was the person that they took prisoner. His name is Amarant, I believe. So they take him prisoner. They make up this plan. They said they realize since the Nihil are listening in on them, maybe they should send a fake message to try to make them believe that they're going to start protecting a certain planet, but then protect a different planet instead, because they were able to tap into the Nihil's comms, and they found out that the Nihil have two main targets they want to attack. They either want to attack Hetzel, hit him even harder this time, or they want to attack Cyclor again, because Cyclor was just attacked. They want to hit them when they're even more vulnerable, and really one of the two locations is going to be a really strategic point for them. Hetzel, they have a lot of farms that produce Bacta. If they hit Hetzel, they're going to put back their Bacta production, which is bad for the Republic. If they hit Cyclor, Cyclor is a very strategically placed planet that would give the Nihil a big advantage. So they basically tell the Nihil they're going to protect Hetzel, which makes the Nihil want to attack Cyclor. So that's what happens. In the meantime, they come up with a plan to where Elzar is going to pretend that he's losing control and going to the dark side to try to choke out this prisoner, to try to find out where the Nihil base is. So he basically does just that. He pushes away a few people. He force chokes him up into the air, and he's like, where's the Nihil base? Amarant is like, oh, wow, that's not Jedi-like of you, stuff like that. You know, he's able to scare Elzar away from the confrontation because he has a stinger on his tail. So he whips his tail around. Elzar backs out of the way. Amarant's able to take one of the other people with him prisoner. It's actually the same person that tried to sell the device to Tia Toon. Again, can't remember her name. God dang it. I wish I remember her name. Anyway, Amarant has her hostage in his hands, and he's like, make a move. I'm basically going to kill her. They allow them to escape, but while this whole thing is going on, Bel and Indira stow away on the nearest ship, which they knew Amarant would try to steal to get off-world, because now he's going to have to get off-world to meet up with the Nihil. One thing I've left out of this entire explanation is that Loden Greatstorm is still alive during this whole book. You remember he was taken prisoner in the last book after Marchion went on his attack near Elfrona, I believe it was. So he's, over the last year, he has been weakened and drugged, and his connection to the Force has been weak. He's been unable to use any kind of Force persuasion on anybody because he's not being fed. He's not being treated appropriately to stay healthy. So he's very, very unhealthy and sickened at this point. Bel does not know this. Bel is his former, or still his Padawan, and Bel believes that he has passed away. A lot of the Jedi believe that he's passed away, so he has no idea. So Bel and Indira are stowed away on Amarant's ship, the former Nihil prisoner there. Amarant actually takes the ship to Galzar, which is the home base of the Nihil. So he takes them there. Once they get there, Bel is like, wait, I can feel my master's presence. He's got to be alive here. So they get out of the ship. They realize they have to go try to find Loden. They end up getting into fights with different people. In the meantime, Loden's in his cell. Some of the effects of the drugs they've been giving him are starting to wear off just enough to where he can try to Force persuade the person who's guarding his cell, which he does just enough for that guard to unlock his cell. So he gets out of the cell, attacks the guard that's been guarding his cell to get him out of the way, and then he has to go to try to find his lightsaber. Well, Marchion storms in with his lightsaber and tries to attack him with it. Loden realizes right away Marchion is not skilled with the lightsaber. I could probably take him down pretty easily. So he is able to get his lightsaber back. Marchion is able to kind of escape his grasp at the moment. Loden then has to find his way out of the compound. So he does. Bel finds him. They reunite temporarily, and they're trying to fight off everybody to try to get back to the ship so they can take off. And by the way, Lorna D is also on world with them on Galzar. She's been there most of the time throughout the book, working with Marchion, and she is on planet helping with that operation. So after Loden and Bel meet up, they're fighting off a bunch of people. During that, Marchion actually has the leveler with him on Galzar, the giant beast that can kill Jedi. He releases the leveler in the midst of all this fighting. He's able to escape off world after he releases the leveler. I'm sure he's probably going to come back for it later, but he escapes off world. The Republic show up just in time to try to meet up with the Jedi that are there, but Lorna D is also trying to fight her way off world so she can get away. Indira kind of separates from Bel and Loden for a second. Also, Stellan Gios is part of the Republic that's coming to meet up with them to try to act as backup for them. He finds Bel curled up on the ground, basically crying. I believe he's maybe passed out, but he's like curled up on the ground. And right next to him is the former shell of Loden Greatstorm. So he has now been consumed by the leveler. The book ends with, for the first time since he was a child, Stellan Gios is actually afraid. Very, very dramatic ending to the book. Sets up nicely for subsequent books. Very excited to see the rest of this era play out. Lorna D does fight her way off-world, and when she does, the Republic sees her escape, and now they're mistakenly believing that she is the Eye of the Nihil, not seeing Marchion escape, even though Loden knew that Marchion was the Eye of the Nihil, but he got consumed by the leveler, so no one is able to witness that. What did I think about the book? I thought it was a really nice book. I'm probably not going to score it as well as I should. Sometimes certain details escape me while I'm reading it, so I have to go back. There were times where that happened where I didn't quite know what was going on in the moment. I don't know if it was because the writer, which it was written by Cavan Scott, obviously a celebrated author during this High Republic era. People are really enjoying his material. I really enjoyed it. Thought it was a great book, but I'm going to try not to score it poorly because of that. And I wouldn't score it poorly anyway, but at least score it appropriately. Now we're on to the segment of things that I found interesting, or how can it mesh with Legends. I have a lot of things, like, I don't know if you see this, I take notes when I read the book, and I got a lot for this one, so I'm going to try to go through them quickly. So the prologue takes place on the moon of Tython. My first note kind of pointed to the fact that he's on the moon of Tython, and I thought that Tython was a very difficult planet to reach. If you remember from the Bane trilogy, Darth Bane had to travel to Tython, and on his way to Tython, he was talking about how unstable the lanes were to access Tython. And you would think over time that these lanes would become more and more unstable, because I believe they used to be more stable, and then over time they just became more and more unstable, and it was hard to reach Tython. They were basically in the deep core. Elzar is on the moon of Tython, and No mention of how difficult it was to reach this particular place. So was it easy to reach? Are the lanes stable now? Just curious about the answers to those questions. So my next note is that Udidis was a Talortai, which is a species where it was prevalent that they would be sensitive to the Force. One of the mentions that he makes is similar to what the Path of the Open Hand believed, which was interesting since they were going to meet a contact of Martians that was a member of the Path of the Open Hand. The passage reads like this. The only thing that Dis had in common with the Jedi was his connection to the Force. Many Talortai were sensitive to the energy field that bound the universe together, but few of his species ever made use of it. The cowards. They said it wasn't their right, that to do so was somehow immoral. It doesn't necessarily sound like Udi believes this. He's basically saying that his species as a whole believed that, which is very interesting that a whole species would believe it wasn't their right to use the Force. So now we see some political opinions surrounding the use of the Force during these eras that have been introduced in Star Wars, and it's really, really interesting to read that, because so far in the OT and in the prequels and sequels, you don't really see any kind of differing opinions about the use of the Force. The Force was basically something that everybody regarded as a mystery that everybody respected in a similar way, and using it or not using it wasn't regarded in any different way. But now we're seeing these opinions about whether you should use it or not. Very interesting. We see another use of the phrase that Luke Skywalker utters in The Last Jedi, and that is that no one is ever really gone. And he says that to Leia when he's talking about Han Solo dying at the hands of Kylo Ren. In this book, the phrase is used in the following way. We let it go, Bell said, looking back at the innovator so Indira couldn't see the tears she must have known were in his eyes. The Thalothian reached out, placing a comforting hand on Bell's forearm. I didn't say it was easy, just like a lateral roll. That made him smile again, as did the slight squeeze she gave him before turning back towards the ship. Besides, no one is ever really gone. No matter what happens, Loden will be with you now and forever. He is part of all of us now. So that was kind of like a foreshadowing to say, like, even though you think that Loden's dead, no one's ever really gone. It just kind of goes back to this whole like Star Wars meme that unless you see somebody just disintegrate like they kind of describe in these books, they're not really gone. We could bring him back somehow. And even after that, probably some way we could bring him back. Another thing that I found interesting amongst the different Force users in the book, especially in this book, and we don't really hear any kind of variance in it and other Force users in the prequels or the OT or anything like that, is how different Force users view the presence of the Force. Avar Kriss was describing the Force as a song, and she is able to hear this song of the Force differently in different people and in the atmosphere that surrounds her and stuff like that. Other people view it as a flame, whether the flame is large or small, hot or cold. The flame goes out, it comes back to life, stuff like that. Some people just manifest it as a force, just something that they feel like a physical, tangible thing that they can feel surrounding them, kind of like a spidey sense with Spider-Man, something like that. So just hearing the different ways that they feel the Force manifesting around them, I thought was very interesting. There's one thing that I've been meaning to talk about in basically all of my videos, and I actually meant to do it like 4 or 5 videos ago. I'm going to go on a rant here, but there is a certain word that is prevalent in almost all of Star Wars books, Legends previously and canon now, that is a very unanimously used swear word in Star Wars. I think you all know what I'm talking about. The word is criffing. Every time I read it, I'm just like, criffing? What? What is this? Okay. I know where the word comes from. It's pretty easy to like find the origins of it. It's basically a variation of fricking. You know, back in the day when you had to try to find a replacement word for f***ing, you'd say freaking, you're freaking or fricking. Well, now it's criffing instead of fricking, just to try to make this different word for people to use as a swear word. I get it. You don't want to have the same swear words as they have in on Earth. Like, you want to try to create something different that signifies that they have their own kind of way of swearing, of expressing their emotion in a real authentic way. But it's just weird. It just sounds weird. There's another word they use later in the book, and I'll just briefly say it when I get to it. Here's the other word, cricking. Instead of criffing, now you have cricking. Not even a big variation of the word. I'm at a loss for words when it comes to that. Another thing I found interesting was the fact that, and we talked about the Jedi vectors before and how they're used, and the fact that when Jedi use the Jedi vectors, not that other people can't use them, but other people can't activate the weapons on a vector because you have to have a lightsaber to activate the weapons on a vector. But when Jedi use the vectors, they can use the Force in a way to operate the vector in a much more efficient way than the average person. The vector can be operated by another person, it's just much more inefficient than if a Jedi were to operate it. I imagine other ships ships that are used in the prequels, maybe even the sequels, or maybe even the original trilogy, could also use ships in a similar way just because of their ability to use the Force in that way. Just the fact that these ships were designed for the Jedi to use in this fashion. Why was this needed during this time? The Vectors existed before the Nihil started to become this giant, massive problem. Seemingly, in the Light of the Jedi, when the Vectors were mentioned in that book, they're in peacetime. They've been in peacetime for decades, maybe even hundreds of years. Why did the Jedi need these ships that were so easily used by the Force? Basically seemed like military ships, really, and they're very frequently used in that manner. So why did they need these ships? Just found it as an interesting question to ask. There's a mention of this thing called gossip vids in the book, and it's funny because they're talking about the Chancellor when they mention it. Gossip vids kind of sounds like the paparazzi of the universe. Interesting that they decided to introduce the idea of a paparazzi surrounding politicians. It's funny that we haven't seen the idea of this in any, maybe even in any of the prequels. Maybe it exists in other books, but the idea that there's paparazzi that surround politicians and people of interest is just an interesting thing to introduce into Star Wars. It seems like something that's kind of intuitive that we sort of seen before. First time I'm reading about it, and now you're wondering like, man, where was this? This is kind of something that makes sense that would be there, especially on a planet like Coruscant. Billions of people on the planet, trillions of people on the planet. You'd think that it would be more prevalent to see people like that on the planet. Also, in 231 BBY, and also probably in the previous books, there's a mention of multiple Jedi temples existing throughout the galaxy. So in the particular passage that I'm reading right here, it's on page 133 in the book, and it mentions a temple that exists on Valo, which is where the Republic Fair is taking place. I can't remember if there's any other planets that they suggest there are temples on, but the fact that there's multiple Jedi temples throughout the galaxy, interesting that you only hear of the one on Coruscant in the prequels, obviously none in the original trilogy, but just that, where did they go? I mean, were they still active? Possibly they were. You didn't really need to know more than the one that you knew about on Coruscant just because of how entrenched the politics were in the narrative of the story. So interesting that there's this idea of multiple Jedi temples around, and I'd like to know if they still existed during the prequel era time. So this is a point that is entirely possible, and that's the fact that the Togrutas, which is a species of people that are actually the same race as Shakti in the prequels and also Ahsoka. They are both Togrutas. The book suggests that the Republic didn't venture into Togruta space until 382 BBY, which was the time of Cataclysm, Irano and Iram wars between them. Just interesting that it's only been that long ago before the Republic started venturing into Togruta space. Possible that they've always been there. Maybe they've always been active in the space around the Republic. The Republic has just never, to the planet where the Togrutas exist. The Togrutas actually haven't been a part of the Republic until 231 BBY, and they actually get invited to join the Republic in this book. So one thing that you start to suspect about Ty, the mercenary that was joined with this other person trying to sell that device on Valo before, is that they were someone who was Force sensitive that might have taught themselves about the Force, but Stellan and Elzar start to suggest or predict that maybe this person was a part of the Jedi Order previously, but then left the Jedi Order. That was probably a more likely point, and we actually find out that that's what was true. But I just always wondered if there were Force sensitives that existed in this time period, even though the Jedi Temple was prevalent, if they could have been self-taught in the Force and maybe even created their own lightsaber based on knowledge that could have been passed around. But, you know, we also know that the Jedi kept this knowledge very locked down, and they were also very aware of Force sensitives throughout the universe, or throughout the galaxy, I should say. So very unlikely, but still just kind of interested if there would be any kind of like Bakken Jedi that taught themselves, even with the Jedi Temple being so prevalent throughout the galaxy. This is kind of a boring point, but I just still found it interesting. It feels like, especially reading these books, that certain ideas and things that we associate with things that we know in fiction or even in real life on Earth are kind of being introduced in the same manner in Star Wars fiction. So like the idea of dogs or the idea of fire-breathing dragons, stuff like that. There are things that we associate with things that have, the ideas that have been presented in Earth fiction that's then presented in Star Wars fiction as if they're things that either existed in Star Wars or things that were lore in Star Wars. If you lived within the Star Wars universe, they would be fiction in your life, you know, that you read. So I just find it a little bit lazy when when they use things that we already are familiar with to then be this fictional entity in a Star Wars story. George was so good at creating like not only new concepts, but just new creatures, new stories, new backgrounds of people and creatures that lived throughout the galaxy. And he didn't want to create anything, or it didn't seem like he wanted to create anything that was too similar to things that we knew on Earth, or even create any lore surrounding that. For instance, in this passage I'm reading right here, what I put here was Star Wars uses the metric system. So it's a really small passage. It's just the fire chief is telling her it's none of her business, and she just grabs a hose from the nearest firefighting droid and lets it rip. Putting out the fire, Bill asked? No, putting down the fire chief. Liters of foam right in his face. Liters of foam. I mean, we already had parsecs. That was a measure of distance. Why don't you just make up a different distance unit? Like, does it need to be liters? Like, I don't know. Just found it to be interesting. Maybe I'm nitpicking too much. I don't know. This is something I didn't realize before this book, but it seems like Togrutas, the tendrils that come off of their head, are capable of a form of echolocation. The passage reads like this. Walker's that way, Marma said, pointing ahead as if reading Stellan's mind. Are you sure? Norelquo said, rubbing his inflamed eyes. He is, Stellan said, nodding in thanks. He had heard stories about Togruta montrals, that the cone-like horns gave the species a form of echolocation, but had never seen it in action until now. The Force told him he could trust it. So maybe not the tendrils that came off, but the montrals on their heads, the pointy ears that seems like, that point out from their heads, they're capable of a form of echolocation. Never knew that before. Very interesting point with Togrutas. It's an interesting ability for them to have, especially the Force-sensitive ones that later become Jedi. Although you never hear about it with Ahsoka, I don't believe. But if you do, can someone in the comments tell me where in Ahsoka that would have been mentioned? Either with Shakti, maybe earlier, or with Ahsoka. There's a moment in the book where Bell has to cut a circle through a door, and it's a metal door, and he cuts a circle through it, and then he's able to climb through the circle to try to meet up with his other people that he's with. Well, when he does so, it's described that when you cut a circle, and we all know this to be true, but when you cut a circle or cut anything into metal, the metal kind of turns into molten metal and it melts. How come when Jedi do that, if they go through it, the molten metal isn't dripping on them in some form and hurting them in any way? Are they able to just, I don't know, use a force shield to surround themselves so they don't get metal dripping on them? I just found it interesting that nobody ever gets hurt diving through these holes or jumping through these holes when they just created molten metal surrounding themselves. So probably a moot point, but still interesting nonetheless. I mentioned this before about ideas and fictions that we are familiar with on Earth being introduced into Star Wars. They talk about fire-breathing dragons in this chapter, and the passage reads like this. Ember, you need to be ready, okay? Ember is the name of Bell's sidekick dog, or sidekick hound, I should say. It seems kind of like a dog, but he's a fire-breathing dog. The dog growled, ready to defend them all without hesitation, smoke curling up between her bared teeth. What is that? Senza squeaked. Ever heard of fire-breathing dragons? Only in fairy tales. So not only did they say, have you ever read about fire-breathing dragons? But the other person says, only in fairy tales. So now you have fairy tales in Star Wars, and you had fire-breathing dragons in the fairy tales. I completely get if you want to create something that's relative to things that we're familiar with, so that way it's more tangible for us. I don't know. It just feels like lazy writing to me when you introduce ideas that we're already familiar with, but as if the people in the Star Wars universe have also had these fictional ideas in their life, throughout their life, or throughout other generations of lives. There's a passage in the book that takes place in chapter 40, and it's right at the beginning, where Indira is mentioning a strong connection between two Jedi. And it kind of sounds like she's referencing a dyad, obviously something that we've learned about in The Rise of Skywalker, or at least I don't remember if the dyad was mentioned before that movie in The Last Jedi or the movie before that, but it's definitely more emphasized in The Rise of Skywalker as Kylo Ren and Rey are being identified as a dyad in the Force. So the passage reads like this. No one Jedi had issued the command, not even Porter, who was still perched on the back of her vector. They had just known what to do and when to do it. Indira had heard there were a pair of Kotabi on Starlight, twins from Sagamore who shared such a strong bond that they almost operated as if they had one mind split across two bodies. That sounds familiar to what Rey and Kylo went through, where Kylo could see Rey existing where he was, and Rey could see Kylo existing where she was, even though it seemed like they were in the same room, but all they saw were the backgrounds of where they were. You learn about another metal in this book called Frick that is able to withstand lightsaber blades, just like Beskar can, that we see in The Mandalorian and other stories. By Surik's blade, the Twi'lek woman was impressive. Try as he might, he couldn't force her back, her quarterstaff still in one piece despite numerous strikes from his lightsaber. That in itself wasn't surprising. The staff dated back to the Blood Moon Uprising and was forged of Frick, Phrik, one of the few substances that wasn't susceptible to a lightsaber's blade. Something I'd like to learn more about as well. Where does Frick come from? What do people use it as? Is it valuable in any other way? Is it used as currency? Beskar is obviously used as currency and used to create Mandalorian armor. What is Frick used by? Who uses Frick? They talk about the Blood Moon Uprising. I'm not familiar with that story. If you are, feel free to leave it in the comments. There's also a sport they mentioned in the book called speedball. Sounded like they were talking about baseball. Maybe another form of lazy writing. However, they did use a different sport. They didn't say baseball. If they said baseball, I would have laughed and probably stopped reading the book. But they said speedball, so at least they're trying a little bit to create a different sport that maybe they played. There was kind of a point in the book where Ty and Elzar have to form this connection, and they have to do it to ward off these giant beasts called sandvils. It was interesting because they kind of looked at each other like, okay, we have to do this. Okay, are you ready? And they put their hands together, each hand together in the air, and they have to open their minds up to each other so that way they can trust each other and use some kind of force power to ward off the sandvils. And I just read it thinking, like, how did they know what to do in that moment? They just kind of did it, and they didn't say what they were going to do. They just stood there. And especially since Ty was not associated with the Jedi during this time, she was a former Jedi, or at least with the Jedi Temple before, but she hasn't been a part of the Jedi in some time. So how did she know what to do? How did Elzar know what to do with her? How come Elzar didn't explain what they were about to do? How come he didn't explain what the point of that was? Just felt like a weird part of the story. Just another note that I left here later on, and that's that the High Republic seems to be full of medieval references. You hear about the fire-breathing dragons, the fact that there's so many crossguard hilts lightsabers. I already heard before from somebody else that I was going to see a lot of instances of crossguard lightsabers in the High Republic. Funny that the first time we saw it was in the sequel trilogy, and now we see it a bunch in this book. You hear like people drinking out of goblets, which is kind of like a medieval reference of a cup called a goblet, and maybe that's just a very universal term for cup. When I hear the word goblet, I think of a medieval cup that people use. So it seemed like there's a lot of references that remind you of medieval objects or medieval ideas. Another example of this is there's two guys that shake hands, and when they shake hands, passage says that the two men grasped each other's wrist, which is definitely a handshake, you know, like that. Definitely a handshake that was familiar in any kind of fiction or movie or whatever that referenced medieval type things. Lord of the Rings is kind of like a medieval style movie. They definitely did that kind of a handshake in that movie. So just, yeah, another medieval reference that I noticed. That ends the interesting points that I made. Wow, any of those I did not mention if they could mesh with Legends. I can remember all the points that I made. None of it really suggests that it couldn't mesh with Legends from what I could see or read. There's, again, no mention of Sith in this book, just like in the last book. The one thing I will have to read up on is if Togrutas existed before this time, or at least were interacted with the Republic before this time in other Legends books. Now, I'm obviously reading things in chronological order, so before this book, I don't believe anything I read, and I think I would remember, referenced Togrutas being in Republic space or anything of that nature. So I believe that still stands to where it could still mesh. I don't know if I'm saying this just to be different from the last book, or if I really felt like it was just barely worse than the last book, but I'm going to give it an 8.6. Still an amazing score. I still really enjoyed the book. Very hard to put down. And I don't know, the last book, it was a really interesting introduction into the 232 BBY era of the High Republic, and probably just because of the gravity of the situation that was happening in that book. Not saying that the gravity of the situation wasn't large in this book. It was a good and evil fight versus like this chaotic event that everybody had to try to plan for and protect themselves against. I guess because of that, not quite as interesting as The Light of the Jedi, but still a very, very good book. So 8.6, that's a review for that. Appreciate everybody who stopped by to watch the video today. If you enjoyed the content that you viewed, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also, if you'd like to read this book, there will be a link in the description. Be aware that it's an Amazon affiliate link, so if you use that link, it will help support the channel in some way or form. But don't do it just to support me. Don't just try to support me. Do it so we can continue this awesome conversation about Star Wars, because love talking about Star Wars. Definitely love talking about Star Wars. I appreciate y'all stopping by, and may the Force be with you, and I will see you on the next video. Thanks.